Good morning, everybody. Hope you're all having a good morning so far. A little bit of a rainy day out, but we could use the rain. All right, let's go ahead and get started here, everybody. Today we're looking at Italian and German unification as we continue to progress into the age of real politics. So I'm going to pop it over to my desktop. Here we have the PowerPoint ready to go. So talking about Italian unification, after the collapse of the revolutions of 1848 and 49, unification movement in Italy that had really started under Giuseppe Mazzini shifted to being located mostly out of Sardinia Piedmont, which was a hyphenated Italian kingdom kind of in northwestern Italy under the king of Sardinia Piedmont, a guy by the name of King Victor Emmanuel II. And then two other figures that play a part in Italian unification were Count Cavor and Giuseppe Garibaldi, who we've talked about before because in the early days, during the Romantic revolutionary days of the revolutions of 1848 in Italy, Giuseppe Mazzini had allied with Giuseppe Garibaldi in the south, in Naples. And Garibaldi plays his own interesting role in the Italian unification movement. They replaced earlier leaders like Mazzini, the once liberal Pope Pius IX, who famously put out his syllabus of errors in 1864, calling out all of the liberal changes that were happening across Europe, and then Ghiberti. And realpolitik, instead of romanticism, was used for unification. As I've mentioned before, realpolitik is the application of kind of those old Machiavellian practical political principles and a kind of cutthroat, backstabby form of politics that, you know, a lot of politicians use even today. So here is King Victor Emmanuel II. He was the king of Sardinia Piedmont from 1849 until 1861. And when Italy achieves their unification in 1861, he becomes the king of Italy. So his title changes. Originally, he's King Victor Emmanuel II, king of Sardinia. When he becomes king of Italy, he becomes King Victor Emmanuel I of Italy. Okay, so if you see King Victor Emmanuel I of Italy, King of Italy, it's the same guy. It's just that the Kingdom of Italy had not really ever been recognized going back in history. And so previously, Italy was a fragmented group of a bunch of different states. So when his title changes to King of Italy from King of Sardinia, the Roman numeral behind his name changes as well because there had never been a King Victor Emmanuel of Italy before. So King Victor Emmanuel II of Sardinia or King Victor Emmanuel I of Italy, depending on what part of his career we're talking about. Count Camillo Benso di Cavor of Sardinia Piedmont was kind of the, if we were to do an analogy, it would be something like Germany is to Otto von Bismarck as Italy is to Camillo Benso di Cavour. Okay, he is not a king, but he's a high-ranking political figure, and he served as King Victor Emmanuel II's prime minister between 1852 and 1861. Count Cavour is essentially a moderate nationalist and aristocratic liberal. And so he's not going to be your prototypical conservative from the time. He is going to be reform-minded, but he is going to use nationalism to harness the energy of the spirit of this Italian unification movement in order to carry out his goals. And he replaced the earlier failed unification revolutionaries, such as Mazzini and the Young Italy movement. Unlike Mazzini, Cavour does not employ romantic illusions of a unified Italy, but rather carried out real politics. He was also the editor, Cavour was the editor of a newspaper known as Il Resorgimento. Okay, Il Resorgimento. Resorgimento basically means reorganization. Okay, and they're talking in this newspaper about this unification movement, arguing that Sardinia Piedmont should be the foundation of a new unified Italy. So Cavour, as prime minister, guided Sardinia Piedmont into a liberal and economically viable state, very heavily modeled on the French Constitution of 1830, the one that set up the bourgeois king, King Louis Philippe in France. Back in 1830, they modeled their constitution or their structure of government in Sardinia Piedmont based on that, where some civil liberties are granted, parliamentary government is held with elections, and parliamentary control of taxes is also established. Beyond that, Cavour reformed the judicial system, and he helped to secure the building up of infrastructure like roads, canals, ports, things like that. Also, the law on convents and the Sicciardi law sought to reduce the influence of the Catholic Church in Sardinia Piedmont at this time. And as I said, Pope Pius IX, who originally was kind of considered, for a pope at least, to be rather liberal for a pope, which is saying something because popes are usually largely very, very conservative. But Pope Pius IX issued his Syllabus of Errors, warning Catholics against liberalism, rationalism, socialism, the separation of church and state, which was a movement that had really taken off during the 1860s, and also religious liberty, and, of course, a response to France's secularization of their education system during that same time when Napoleon III, who we talked about last class, revoked the Fallow laws, and that ended up upsetting the Pope, because remember that the Fallow laws had previously, just about a decade and a half earlier, given control of the education system of France back over to the Roman Catholic Church in return for conservative support from the Church. And so as the Pope, Pius IX, starts to see these liberal changes being made during the early part of the Age of Realpolitik, he issues this Syllabus of Errors, essentially raking all of these European political figures over the coals as a result of the reforms, the pragmatic reforms that they were starting to make. Now, Count Cavour sought Italy for the northern and central areas of Italy. There were concerns about the south because the south had notoriously been more rural, more independent, and culturally slightly different from northern Italian states. Even to this day, if you go to Italy and you talk to people from Venice, as I have done, I went to Italy a few years ago in the summer of 2018. I went to Italy and I went all over the place, but I went all the way up to Venice, which is northeastern Italy. And as I was in Venice and I was telling them where I was going next, which was all the way to the southern tip of the heel of the boot of Italy, they immediately started trash talking the people in southern Italy and how rude they are and this, that, the other. To be honest with you, I was treated perfectly nicely in southern Italy. It was absolutely beautiful. And even today, my point is to say that even today in Italy, there is something of a cultural, stigma of northern Italians versus southern Italians. I guess we kind of have one here in the United States as well, where people kind of look at the South, places like Alabama and Mississippi and stuff, as being backwards or whatever. I'm not saying, I'm not trashing them. My family, my dad's side of the family was from Georgia, but I'm just saying that, like, sometimes realistically, even going back in our own history in America, people kind of have different feelings about the North versus the South, probably attached to the Civil War and other things like that. But the point basically being that in Italy, you kind of have this divide that at first makes it appear as though it's going to be hard to get the South on board for a unification movement, particularly because Cavour has no political authority in the South. And so in 1855, Italy joined Britain and France in the Crimean War against Russia, and as a result, they gained France as an ally during this time. The Plombières in 1858. The Plombières, that's actually a French word, but it's because it has something to do with Napoleon III. Cavour, okay, the Plombières, Cavour gained a promise from Napoleon III that France would support a Sardinian war with Austria for the creation of a northern Italian kingdom that would be controlled by Piedmont Sardinia, or Sardinia Piedmont. Now, here's the thing about that. This Plombières, the promise that Napoleon III made, he ends up backing out of that promise. And this is another one of those things that, Napoleon III probably really would have been okay with helping Italy out with their unification movement, but remember that Napoleon III was constantly being criticized and lambasted by the media in France for his foreign policy. Liberals in France were constantly critical of Napoleon III's foreign policy, and this is a foreign policy issue. So he makes this promise in 1858 that France would support a Sardinian war with Austria, but ultimately fearing going to war with Austria and then potentially Prussia, which could have gotten involved, they end up not coming through on this promise. The French kind of leave the Italians to figure it out for themselves. Now, if they had, what would France get out of it? They would get Savoy and Nice, which at the time were controlled by Italy. But Austria ends up declaring war on Sardinia in 1859 after being provoked. And at that time, Napoleon III backs out on Victor Emmanuel II, and Italy is kind of forced to deal with it on their own. Sardinia Piedmont gained Lombardy during the early part of its war with Austria in 1859, but did not gain Venice. Venice famously was controlled by Austria for a long time. And France briefly came to Sardinia's aid in 1859 thanks to the Plombières, but soon backed away from that Plombières agreement because of a fear of war with Prussia, Austria's strength, military strength, the revolutionary unrest that was happening in northern Italy, and, of course, French public concern over a war with Catholic Austria. going to war against another Catholic nation at this time. Not really a wise political choice for France. And so they back away from that Plombières agreement. And in 1860, Count Cavor, Prime Minister of Sardinia-Piedmont, arranged the annexation of Parma, Modena, Romagna, and Tuscany into the Kingdom of Sardinia. So he's going around politically annexing several of these northern and central states. And France supported Cavour in return for receiving the territories of Nice and Savoy. Meanwhile, in the south, you have this whole other movement that's happening under the leadership of Giuseppe Garibaldi, who liberated southern Italy and Sicily. And so Giuseppe Garibaldi was a southern revolutionary, and Garibaldi, unlike Cavour, who was more of a realpolitik, pragmatic politics sort of a guy, Giuseppe Garibaldi still had remnants of exemplifying that romantic nationalism of the earlier era of 1848. He kind of had this emotional, tall tale status about him. And the spirit of Mazzini and earlier young Italy revolutionaries is kind of characterized by Giuseppe Garibaldi's efforts in the South. And the big question is, because Cavour doesn't really have a lot of influence in the places where Garibaldi does, is there going to be a conflict between Garibaldi and Cavour in terms of who ends up taking the reins as the main architect of Italian unification? Because you kind of have these two forces, one in the north under Cavour in Sardinia-Piedmont, and then one in the south led by Garibaldi out of Sicily and Naples. And so what's going to happen? Are they going to come into conflict with one another? How is this going to work out? Because they kind of have two unification movements happening in two different places at once. So in May of 1860, Garibaldi and his 1,000 red shirts, the red shirts were the leaders, the followers of Giuseppe Garibaldi's romantic revolutionary movement from the south. They landed in Sicily, which is, if Italy is like a boot, Sicily is like the stone that it looks like the boot is kicking. And so Garibaldi lands in Sicily and extended the nationalist activity to the south. And by September, Garibaldi had taken control of Naples and the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, which previously had been controlled by France, actually. But so you've got this unification movement led by Garibaldi in the southern part of Italy, and although Cavour distrusted Garibaldi, Victor Emmanuel II encouraged Garibaldi's exploits in the south of Italy. So this is kind of an interesting political acumen thing here as well, because Cavour is threatened by Garibaldi. Cavour wants to be the one who goes down in the history books as the architect of Italian unification. He doesn't want the wind to be taken out of his sails by Garibaldi and his exploits in the south. Cavour insisted that Sardinia-Piedmont be the foundation of the Italian nation. And so what is interesting about this is when it comes to the point at which decisions have to be made about the pragmatic execution of this unification movement, Garibaldi, rather than putting up a fuss, rather than putting up a stink, Garibaldi allows his conquests to be absorbed into Sardinia-Piedmont. So those areas which he had begun to unify in the south, he basically hands over to King Victor Emmanuel II and Prime Minister Cavour. And here you can see an image, an 1860 political cartoon with Garibaldi, who is on his knee, and Victor Emmanuel II, King of Sardinia Piedmont. And of course, you can see he is fitting a boot onto the leg, the right leg of the king. And the boot is, of course, a reference to Italy. It's like a heeled boot. And then in the caption beneath, it says, "Right leg in the boot at last. Garibaldi, if it won't go on, sire, try a little more powder," like baby powder. And so basically, this is a thing that shows Garibaldi's deference to King Victor Emmanuel II in the movement to make Italy a complete unified state between both the northern and southern provinces. And the idea being that if Garibaldi had resisted this, probably it would have resulted in more conflict and disunity for Italy. And so being that they both had the same goal of Italian unification, Garibaldi recognizes his place. He is not a legitimate monarch, and he felt that having King Victor Emmanuel II of Sardinia Piedmont in charge of the movement and leading the way would create more stability in the long run for a unified Italy. So, in February of 1861, Victor Emmanuel, now King of Italy, Victor Emmanuel I, is declared and begins presiding over an Italian parliament which represented all of Italy with the exception of Rome, which was still part of the Papal States, and Venice, which was still controlled by Austria at the time. So now, of course, Rome and Venice are part of Italy, although technically, the Vatican is in Rome, and it is technically its own independent nation. But the rest of Rome is the capital of Italy. So here's the Victor Emmanuel Monument, which you can go and visit in Rome. And as you can see, it's an absolutely massive structure. It's done in the style of neoclassicism. Hopefully you recognize that by now with the triangular pediments and the columns, pillars, and so on and so forth. So moving forward, in 1866, a short time later, just 5 years after the Kingdom of Italy is proclaimed, 5 years later, Venice gets incorporated into the Italian kingdom as a result of an alliance between Victor Emmanuel I and German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who was leading his own unification movement up in Germany at this time. So Sardinia had agreed to open up a front against Austria during the Austro-Prussian War. And that's because Prussia declared war on Austria for the purposes of, well, really mostly exerting their military dominance over Austria, but also Bismarck had his own goals. We'll get to this in a second. I don't want to go on a giant tangent right now, but suffice it to say, when Prussia declares war on Austria, Italy, seeking to get lands back from Austria, decides to join on the Prussian side, and also making a wise bet that Prussia was probably going to beat Austria in the war. The idea was, if Italy joins in and helps, maybe they can get some concessions and have that area of what was known as Italia Irredenta returned to them in the form of Venice and other surrounding territories there in northeastern Italy that Austria had been controlling. By 1871, Rome was captured by Italian troops and became the capital of the Kingdom of Italy. France had just been defeated by Germany in the Franco-Prussian War and could no longer defend the Papal States afterwards, and this is what opens the door to the Kingdom of Italy going into annex and take over Rome. So here you can kind of see, let's see, maybe I have to do this. This should be an animation. Let's do slideshow from current slide. Yeah, there we go. So I know it's on full screen right now, but hopefully you can see this. This is an animated image here within the PowerPoint, but it only works if you have it in full screen mode. But what you can see here as time goes on for the Italian unification movement is eventually how the whole Italian peninsula becomes unified, and how basically the gray areas of Piedmont, Sardinia, which is, here's Piedmont, here's Sardinia. Sardinia is actually an island, but Piedmont, Sardinia is hyphenated. They're both under the same control at the start of it. This thing's about to reset in just a moment here. It kind of moves quickly, so watch what happens. Here it starts off Piedmont, Sardinia. They start consolidating lands in the north and in the central parts of Italy. Rome was controlled by the Papal States. Meanwhile, Garibaldi's movement down here is annexing these areas and unifying them. Garibaldi gives his word to Victor Emmanuel II, and then eventually Venice is taken and Rome is taken. All right, Venice had been controlled, remember, by the Austrian Empire up here under the Austrian crown, and it's not until 1866 that they get that back, and then 1871, when France loses the Franco-Prussian War, the Italian military moves into Rome and takes over Rome. All right, so this gives you a nice visualization of kind of how this unification movement happened. Even though politically unified, we have to understand that a great social and cultural gap separated the progressive and industrializing North from the stagnant and agrarian South. And so even though Italy was unified, as I mentioned, there are some pretty stark cultural differences between northern Italy and southern Italy. And those differences are recognizable even when you go to Italy today. German unification under the Hohenzollern dynasty of Prussia. After 1815, Prussia emerged as an alternative to a Habsburg-based Germany. Remember that for a long time, the Austrian Germans had really controlled, a lot of European continental politics going back for hundreds of years. They were a major influence, a major player, going all the way back to the 1500s with like Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor of the times of Henry VIII and stuff like that. But as we have moved forward throughout the class, Prussia, under the Hohenzollern dynasty, really had dramatically improved their military prowess in particular. And by 1849, Austria had blocked the attempt of Frederick William IV of Prussia to unify Germany from above. This was known as the humiliation of Olmütz. And as a result of the humiliation of Olmütz and the failure of the Frankfurt Parliament in 1849, the Grossdeutsch Plan, which was the plan for a unified Germany that included both Prussia and Austria, ultimately failed. It met its demise. And so this Grossdeutsch Plan, think about like gross domestic product. When we use that word gross, we're talking about not like, ew, that's gross. We're talking about like the whole thing, gross domestic product, total amount, okay? And when we say Grossdeutsch, we're talking about the entire German population, regardless of whether they were from Austria or Prussia or anywhere else, unifying into a giant German state. That does not happen. Instead, they begin advocating for what becomes known as the Kleindeutsche Plan. The way you can remember that is this one declines Austria, if you will. Okay, that's not where the word comes from, but if it helps you to remember it, then you can use that trick. Okay, Kleindeutsch, as in Austria is getting declined, and Prussia is going to be the one to advocate for the taking the leadership in the German unification movement. So, Kleindeutsche Plan, a unified Germany without Austria, was seen as the most practicable means of unification among the various German states, but particularly Prussia, who did not want to have to compete with Austria during the unification movement. Also remember that during the German Bund days, There was the Zollverein going back to, should say 1834, which was the biggest source of tension between Prussia and Austria because it excluded Austria. Austria, of course, tried unsuccessfully to destroy it. Enter Otto von Bismarck, who led the drive for a Prussian-based Hohenzollern Germany, Hohenzollern-led unified Germany. He is of a Junker background, okay? Junker is that old school Prussian noble term that we use for Prussian aristocrats and high-ranking military officers and people of that nature. So Otto von Bismarck is himself a Junker, which means he's probably going to be more conservative because he comes from the noble class. He is obsessed with power, and he proposes this idea known as gap theory. Gap theory gained Bismarck's favor with the king. Basically, during the early years of Bismarck's chancellery, that's his position, that's his official title, Chancellor to the Emperor, or Chancellor to the King of Germany, or King of Prussia, rather. There was this army bill crisis that created a stalemate between the king and the Prussian legislature over reforms of the army. And Bismarck gained favor with the king by presenting this idea of gap theory to the king and insisting that the Prussian Constitution contained a gap because it did not mention what was to be done if a stalemate developed. So they have this stalemate. There's a stalemate means that no side is winning. That in chess, a stalemate is when you keep moving your pieces around the board, but neither player has enough to instigate a checkmate. And so Bismarck saying, well, because no one's winning and because the Prussian Constitution doesn't call for what should happen, that there is a gap in the Constitution where the king has the power to kind of supersede things. And since the king had granted the Constitution, Bismarck insisted that he just ignore liberals from the middle class in Prussia in the legislature and follow his own judgment. And that famously came to a head with the quote that I read for you before, where he said, "The great questions of the day will not be decided by speeches and resolutions." That was the blunder of 1848 and 49, but by blood and iron. In other words, he's saying sometimes you gotta put your boots on and get to work and just kind of commandeer the situation and make things happen. All right, not fancy speeches or anything like that. Blood and iron, and that gives you kind of a sense of the political ruthlessness of Otto von Bismarck. So what does the government do? They continue to collect taxes even though Parliament refused to approve the budget, and voters countered by sending liberal majorities to the Reichstag, the German parliament, the German legislature, between 1862 and 1866. Meanwhile, Bismarck oversaw a number of reforms that improved the Prussian military. Bismarck is trying to really hone his focus on military reform and improving the Prussian military because Prussia is in a delicate position geographically in Europe. It is surrounded basically on all sides by major powers of France, Austria, and Russia, meaning that they don't want a situation where all three nations, and then maybe even Britain and others, team up against Germany, because Germany would have to defend themselves on either side of their state. And so Prussia, knowing the fragile position that they hold in terms of geography, had been for a long time deliberate about building up their military and making sure that they have proper defenses in place. To justify the increase of the army, he warned that the great questions of the day will be made by decisions of blood and iron. And so what does he mean by blood and iron? What he means is waging war, but in an isolated, precise surgically planned out way. And no one was better at this in the late 1800s than Otto von Bismarck was. He went out of his way to ensure that when the Prussian military was used to fight a war, that many times it was used in a what was ostensibly a defensive capacity. He would goad prod other nations into declaring war on Prussia, and then knowing that his military was superior, go in and take the lands that he always intended to have. So, for example, in Denmark, the Prussian-Danish War of 1863, that just so happens to be the same time that the American Civil War is going on over on the opposite side of the ocean, Germany and Austria defeated Denmark and took control of the two provinces of Schleswig and Holstein. And these two places end up being incorporated into the German state. The provinces were to be jointly administered by Prussia and Austria, but conflicts over the jurisdiction led to a major war between Prussia and Austria. So when Germany goes and takes these lands from Denmark, he was supposed to be jointly administering those lands with Austria, but ultimately they do not agree on how Schleswig and Holstein should be, where the jurisdiction should be for either Prussia or Austria. So this causes a conflict, and Austria ends up going to war with Prussia. This is sometimes called the German Civil War or the 7 Weeks' War. That's the other side about Prussian wars under Bismarck. They are very short. They go by very quickly. He, remember, isolated, localized conflicts with the deliberate intention of exacting military authority and also carving out small swaths of land that Prussia wanted to absorb. So the Austro-Prussian War, 7 Weeks' War, that's less than 2 months long, of 1866, Bismarck sought a very localized war. He made diplomatic preparations for war with Austria by negotiating first with France, Italy, and Russia to make sure that none of them interfere in what goes on. He wanted this to be a one-on-one, one versus one, one nation versus the other nation war between Prussia and Austria, and not have other military powers like France, Italy, or Russia interfere, get themselves involved, and turn this into a giant conflict. Okay, that's the brilliance of Otto von Bismarck, all right? Trying to make sure to use diplomacy to secure his own political aims. Prussia's use of railroads to amass troops and use of the breech-loading rifle, which is a rifle where a breech-loading rifle is one where you load the cartridges into the side of the chamber, and these military industrial improvements proved superior to Austria's military efforts, and the war is over rather quickly. Prussia's victory ends up unifying much of Germany without Austria, and thus the Kleindeutsche Plan prevailed. Austria was given generous peace terms, though, afterwards. However, Italy does receive Venice from Austria. And so here you can see the alliances of the German Civil War. In the pink areas there, you have the Austrian Empire. In the blue areas, you have the Kingdom of Prussia, and you have some disputed territories of Schleswig and Holstein up in Denmark, which Germany had only recently just taken over. That's what really caused the conflict in the first place. And then you also had a number of neutral German principalities in this as well. Remember that all of these had previously been individual German states, 39 different German states. And after the Austro-Prussian War, they are more or less going to unify under Prussian leadership. In 1867, the North German Confederation, established by Bismarck with King William I as president, was established. It included all the German states except for Baden, Württemberg, Bavaria, and Saxony. And the federal constitution of the North German Confederation allowed each state to retain its own local government. The parliament, aka the Reichstag of Germany, consisted of two houses, a lower house and an upper house, that shared power equally. The upper house is known as the Bundesrat, which included representatives from each of the states in the Bund, the North German Confederation. And then the lower house was known as the Bundestag and had several representatives elected by universal male suffrage. As you can see in the south, those areas had not yet been pulled into the Northern German Confederation in red. The southern German states that joined in 1870 to form the German Empire are in orange, but they don't join right away. Alsace Lorraine is this tan territory that looks kind of like the top of an arrow over here. That is the border area between modern-day Germany and France. And it was annexed during the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. And so these territories now are back in French control, and have been since the end of World War II. But at this time, after the Franco-Prussian War, Germany had annexed these lands here, and that's because there were a lot of these lands here are kind of a border region. Some of the towns are German, some of the towns are French, but for the most part now these are this is all French land today. Okay, so the new government structure gave Bismarck the ability to basically completely circumvent the middle class by appealing directly to the working classes, as Napoleon III was doing in France. And so the German middle class did not regain its influence until World War I. And here you have the Franco-Prussian War, the last of the three small but significant conflicts on the path towards German unification. The Franco-Prussian War, again, another short war. It only lasts a handful of months. And it gets started by something known as the Alms Dispatch. The Alms Dispatch of 1870 is where Bismarck didn't want to declare war on France. He's trying to provoke a war with France in order to further unify Germany and annex Alsace and Lorraine, these areas that I was just pointing out here, these borderlands between Germany and France. And so the Alms Dispatch was where Bismarck boasted that a French diplomat had been kicked out of Germany after asking William I, not to interfere with the succession to the Spanish throne. And this was considered a snub by the French. So this is why Bismarck's a genius. He comes out, makes a very public statement that is deliberately trying to aggravate, agitate, and provoke France. It was intentional, okay? And so France and Napoleon III are infuriated, and this Alms Dispatch is really a clever ploy by Bismarck to get France so angry that they will declare war against Germany. And so here you can see an infuriated France declares war against Germany. Wilhelm I of Prussia and Count Benedetti, who was the French ambassador to Prussia at Bad Alms, and so they basically put this dispatch out bragging about how they kicked this diplomat out. Bismarck used this war with France to bring the four remaining southern German states into the North German Confederation: Bavaria, Baden, Württemberg, and Saxony. And the apparent ease with which France was defeated by Prussia sent shockwaves through Europe, because France was still at this time considered a great military power, and the Prussians come in there and absolutely give them a shellacking. And so people are starting to get concerned after the Franco-Prussian War, because it seems that Germany, this new unified Germany, is going to once again upset the balance of power in Europe. and just as France had done a century earlier. So Paris fell to the Germans in January of 1871, and Napoleon III gets captured. Remember, that was what ended his career as Emperor of France and also put an end to the Second French Empire. The battles of Sedan and Metz were particularly decisive in Prussia's victory, and the peace that is negotiated afterwards is known as the Treaty of Frankfurt, signed in May of 1871, where Alsace and Lorraine, these two border territories I was showing you, were ceded over to Germany, which is now, after the Franco-Prussian War, a unified state, including these southern orange regions down here, going all the way over to East Prussia over on this side. So, we are going to stop right there because that's a pretty good stopping point. Plus, I have an assignment for you for today. I'd like you guys to go on to Canvas here. I'm going to go to the assignment section, and I'm going to give this to you. This is another Hippo assignment, so this is going to be Unification Hippo. And I'm going to use this. Oops. Course documents. Okay. Use that to complete the Hippo on this. Oops, do the same thing. There we go. All right, so I have these documents here, Italian, German unification secondary sources. Make this worth 20 points. I'm going to be doing a lot of updating to the grade book today. This will be due for Friday, 8 a.m. Open today. Save and publish. And then also, under assignments, I will put up for you the new reading guide questions. Oops, chapter 22. We're just going to do questions 26 through 26 to, we'll do 36. 26 to 36. For whatever reason, that one doesn't have a little parenthesis next to it, but okay. All right, we're going to do this. Okay. And we'll make this worth 12 points. Make that due on Friday as well. Okay, so that is today's class, kids, and thank you so much for tuning in today on German and Italian unification. Please do the Hippo assignment and get the questions for Chapter 22 reading guide done. I'm going to be updating a bunch of grades here today and putting in quarter grades, quarter grades, remember, don't mean anything in terms of your transcript or college applications, but they are due this week, so I'm going to get them done today. And other than that, have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll see you back on Friday morning. Take care.